ponds. So I want to make sure I don't go too long today, but that I get them all in because I do have a lot today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is Women Owning Woodland, our virtual lady landowner lunches. Today I'm going to talk about ponds. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of what's in the pond and things that we can do to improve our pond health overall and considerations for things, particularly plants is what I'm focused on a lot today, about control of plants, because that seems to be a lot of our pond problems are have too much of this or too many plants, and it's just coating in the whole thing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I also, one of the asks that for reasons of including ponds in our talks is that I had a landowner that asked about a little bit about what they should do terrestrially that can help their pond. So I included some slides on that as well, because sometimes our pond health is a reflection of not what's necessarily always happening in the pond, but also what's happening around the pond. So we'll talk about those things today as well. So there might be periodic pauses as I let people in because I do have the waiting room on. So just letting you know what those pauses are. So just our quick overview we do every week about what Women Owning Woodland is. So that's a program that's being developed to provide our learning opportunities for women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. We have field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared toward women forest landowners. In fact, I didn't put it on my upcoming events because I haven't set a date, but this December I'll be doing a Women Owning Woodland, another timber sale field day down at Southwest Center. So it'll be all about timber sales. Also, there is a Facebook page for Women Owning Woodlands, Missouri. This is a good place to share events or opportunities or connect with other women landowners that you might have questions for. So, and then the upcoming events, these aren't all WOW, actually none of these are WOW events. They're kind of general classes that are just coming out of MU Extension Natural Resources. But next week, 26th, 27th, and 28th in the evening. So it's an evening webinar series, 7 to 8:30. Myself and our agronomy specialist, Gatlin Bunton, and then Carly, who was on here a couple weeks ago with National Deer Association. We are going to do a presentation on establishing and maintaining food plots for wildlife. So if you have interest, there's online registration through Extension for that. It does have a fee of $25. So that's coming up pretty quick. And November 5th, if you're interested, we're doing chainsaw safety class at Wordak Research Farm in Cook Station. I know that's not a convenient location for a lot of folks, but it is a full day class. So the morning will be in a classroom. We'll talk about chainsaw selection, PPE, maintaining your saw, parts of the saw, and then there'll be lunch. And for the afternoon, there'll be felling and bucking demonstration. And then our hope is to put the chainsaws, let each person have a chance to practice using the chainsaw or try it out. So that is coming soon, November 5th. There is a fee of $50 for that one, but if you're interested in coming, contact me ahead of time because I have quite a few scholarships available to give for that one as well. And then this day after that, we're going to do a walk in the woods at Wordak Research Farm as well. So same location. It is a free event, and that'll be morning is kind of talking like forest regeneration, look at the timber sale we have in progress down there. And then the afternoon will be a little bit kind of some wildlife piece, and then also a shiitake mushroom demonstration as well. So that's all that's coming up. And then there will be some November lunch and learns as well. I'm still putting together the schedule, but the first one will be for November will be on overwintering pollinators because we missed that at the beginning of October. Okay, pond problems. So this is usually a very typical picture that I get is that a pond that is covered in some kind of mossy green substance. How do I get rid of this? What do I do with this? So hopefully we'll talk about these things today. So here's kind of the number one problems, all of the most complained about problems with ponds. So first is aquatic weed identification and control. This is a link to Aquaplant. There's a lot of pictures that came from here, but that is another extension that has some of the plants. They have a really good plant ID. MDC also has some great stuff, and I have some links to them as well as we go through. But aquatic weeds are by far the #1 pond issue. And oftentimes we run into this problem with weeds, plants, algae, because there's so many nutrients in the water, that this is kind of feeding those plants. It's like feeding your house plants, where when we feed those aquatic plants, they get runoff, a lot of nitrogen and phosphates, and this can lead to them just kind of going crazy. And so some aquatic weed is a good thing. So aquatic weeds and plants, they provide protection for fish. So a lot of fish lay their eggs and rear their young kind of in the shallows. And if those tiny little fish have places to hide among aquatic vegetation, that is a good thing. However, there can't be too much of a good thing when we talk about aquatic weeds, because they and we'll talk about why it happens and why they do it. But essentially, when plants die, so we have so many aquatic weeds, and then we get to winter and they die back, and they kind of all die at the same time. All of that decomposition of those aquatic weeds, the process of decomposition utilizes oxygen, and it pulls it from the water. So this can lead to low oxygen levels in your water, which can lead to fish kills. So that's like the biggest concern. But then also just from an aesthetics point and from a utilization point. So if you have your pond for things like recreational fishing, perhaps kayaking, or utilizing it for some type of recreation, the vegetation can also be a nuisance because of that. Other problems we get is a lot of like low to no water. So in parts of Missouri, we've seen what we call kind of a micro drought, this kind of end of summer, beginning of fall, and this can lead to low and no water. So that can be a problem. And sometimes it's just assessing where the water's coming from, assessing your pond for things like leaks. Other ones is fish stocking and restocking. So kind of figuring out the balance that you have in your pond. Especially smaller ponds can be hard to reach a balance where your fish are kind of living in harmony and you have the right numbers. Another problem is grubs in fish. So this is parasites that we sometimes find in fish. I don't have actually any answers for those, but it is a typical problem that comes out a lot. Beavers and muskrats, so they tend to make homes. And I should have added to here also otters, because they can be, all three of them can be problems. So beavers become a problem if they'll go around, make their home in a pond, and then they do a lot of damage actually to the terrestrial side, but they'll dam up moving water and kind of make themselves at home. And that can be a nuisance. They can also cause damage to if your pond has been built with a dam on it, they can cause damage to that. Same with muskrats. So they'll make, muskrats make their dens in the actual like dirt, or they'll make dens kind of like underwater that goes up into the land that surrounds the pond. And so muskrat holes in dams that have been established to hold your pond in place, they can cause leaking and overall damage to that. And then otters, unfortunately, so they were a species that was pretty much completely removed from Missouri from over trapping and hunting of them. And then they were reintroduced and reestablished when they've been pretty successful in their reestablishment. And they unfortunately can get into a pond and eat a lot of fish in a short period of time. And if you've been working on establishing your fish populations, this can be pretty devastating. And so for nuisance animals, and I skipped over geese, that's another nuisance animal that shows up at folks' ponds. And Canada geese used to be, they used to migrate, and most of them still do, but in some places we end up with resident geese, and they can cause just a lot of aesthetically and just for use, where they defecate can be a fairly large nuisance to any pond. pond owner. So contacting your local conservation agent, they can give you guidance on what to do about your wildlife problems. Turtles is another one. So I've had calls that folks are very concerned about turtles. So most turtles are actually pretty harmless, and we like to see them. So our turtle populations, we're always happy to see turtles, but some folks get very concerned about snapping turtles because they will eat some of your fish. So, and again, that's another call to your conservation agent to talk about how you can perhaps manage those in your pond. Aquatic weed control. So it's always tricky because we want to control the weeds, but we don't want to hurt any of the animals that are in our pond. So fish, amphibians, any of those that are using our pond. We do recommend treatment for aquatic weeds when they cover more than 25% of the pond surface area. So this is kind of that threshold, and you just kind of look at your pond surface and decide that if you've exceeded that threshold or not. Because if you have more than 25%, again, when we have kind of that winter dieback, this can lead to a lot of deoxygenation of your pond. Aquatic weed control probably is the biggest piece of today's talk, but talking about the different types of control and some identification for you. So if you have a smaller pond, you can do some physical control by simply getting in your pond and removing some of that vegetation. If you have a pond of any size, this is usually not super feasible, but I do have some landowners that do some of their own by removing things like lilies. They'll get in there and kind of physically remove them. This always kind of makes me laugh. So I actually spent a summer working for the conservation department, and they were trying to reestablish vegetation in some of their managed ponds that they have in a conservation area. So I spent a summer digging up spatterdock and some other valsinaria, some other aquatic vegetation, so that they could plant it in their ponds that they had at this conservation area. So I actually spent a whole summer trying to establish aquatic vegetation, which is kind of the opposite of what I talk about most of the time these days. Chemical control and biological control are other two types of control that you might that we can use for aquatic weeds. And I'll give you some of those details, like I said. Just for kind of IDing. So this is planktonic algae. This is essential to our life. So I shouldn't say essential, but it is useful because our fish, a lot of our small fish, they will utilize this as a food source. But it can cause fish kills by lowering the oxygen. So too much of this, again, is a bad thing because it can cause, again, as it dies back, it's going to suck in that oxygen, and it is going to cause kind of long-term fish kill problems. We'll talk about the different ways to remove planktonic algae, but it is usually indicative of a really high nutrient load making its way into the pond. And this can be coming from runoff from like gray water. It can also be coming from runoff from livestock areas. So oftentimes there's pretty high nitrogen and phosphate content in livestock waste, and then rains on it and it runs into our pond, and this can cause a really high nutrient load that can lead to these conditions. Filamentous algae is another one that's really just not appealing, doesn't look good, it doesn't, it's not conducive to fishing in your pond. It's just kind of a nuisance. So this is an algae, and it is these single cells that form these really long chains, and then they kind of form up usually off the bottom, and they will eventually float up to the top like you see in these pictures, but they have actually no direct impact on food chains. So it really is pretty much a nuisance plant to have. And again, we'll talk about control. I'm just going to give you identification for some things. Floating plants, So these can be free floating or rooted, or sometimes rooted with floating leaves. And these again are our most common: duckweed, watermeal, water lily, and American lotus. So again, just helping with identification. So water lily and American lotus, a lot of folks kind of use the terms interchangeably. Water lily is going to stay pretty much strictly floating on top of the pond, and those pads will stay again touching the water, and then they do put up that usually it's a typical yellow flowers, usually what we see with them. Lotus is going to have most of it, so it'll have some that float on top of the water, but it generally will put a lot more leaves up higher. So they're still lily pad shaped, but they are going to extend up out of the water. Duckweed or watermeal. So these are in the same family of plants. So these are actually free floating plants. So if you look kind of close, especially at the duckweed, it has more noticeable, but they have root systems, but they are going to be directly in the water, and they pull their nutrients in their water from that, but they're free floating. And these can be a nuisance if they are in super high numbers. Just about any body of water is going to have just a little bit of duckweed or watermeal. But there is this website, and I'll share these when I send out the recordings after this. But MDC has a great aqua guide that helps, gives advice on the control of both of these floating plants. So, and again, they can be a nuisance if they cover the entire pond. We have seen, big diebacks of duckweed, and then that can again lead to kind of that deoxygenation issue that we see. Submerged plants, these are ones that grow mainly below the surface, and they have very soft stems. So this comes from them being again submerged in water all the time. So the first one is the American pondweed. So this is a plant. It's rooted generally it has roots that are in the pond bottom, and then it kind of puts off these long tendrils that have these leaves attached that you see floating at the surface. So, and they oftentimes do float up to the surface. They're still going to do photosynthesis. So that's where we see them. But this is again pretty common in Missouri. So I have heard this pronounced multiple ways, so I'll pronounce it both ways for you. But Elodia or Elodia, this is a common plant that you can find it in aquariums, but we also find it in our ponds. This is, so hydrilla, which I'm going to show you better pictures of. Hydrilla is a really nuisance invasive species, and if you have hydrilla, you should definitely report that to your local fish biologist with MDC, because it is a highly invasive species that they are working very hard to control when they find it in Missouri. Elodia, not as bad, not so much. It's usually a pretty typical. The easiest way to kind of tell the difference, and this picture really shows, is that hydrilla has kind of whorls of 5 of the leaves, and Elodia is going to be whorls of 3. Egeria, this is not one that we see very often in Missouri, but it has a whorl of 4. A water milfoil, this is another nuisance species that we do like to remove if we find it. It's considered an invasive. I haven't had too many reports of this one, but it has a very feathery leaves, and then kind of these very long tendrils that can be a nuisance in ponds. And like I said, it is considered an invasive species. And then over here is southern naiad. Not a lot of this in Missouri, but it is another aquatic plant that you might find in your pond. Coontail, very common pond plant, and it can grow very thick quite quickly. It's again fairly soft, pliable stem. It usually kind of forms almost, it seems like almost forest-like conditions in ponds as it grows up from the bottom. And then emergent plants. So these are rooted in water, but most of their foliage is above the water. And we tend to find our emergent plants on the closer to the bank. So in the shallow portion of our ponds. So this is arrowhead. Again, this one's a native. It is, I've not had any reports of arrowhead getting out of hand for any landowners. This is one that, you know, you might control with some physical actual pulling of them to clear perhaps casting roots into your pond. But it does provide a lot of value in that it, again, provides kind of those nesting areas, nurseries for small fish. Cattails, this is one that can get, we're probably all familiar with cattails. They can get out of hand pretty quick. And controlling them is usually of importance. They don't contribute as much to, so sometimes they just really limit pond accessibility, but they do not contribute as much because they are in those shallow areas when they die back, because a lot of the dieback tends to stay in the shallows. So it doesn't contribute kind of as much to that deoxygenation, but again, they can still be a nuisance if there's a lot of them. And then water primrose. This is another one that it grows pretty thick and can cause just a hindrance to, you know, recreational fishing in a pond, access to the pond. This one also can die back and lands or falls in the water, which can lead to that deoxygenation. So other invasives to watch for. So like I said, hydrilla is one that we are very, have a lot of concerns about. And if you do suspect that you have it, you should contact your local fisheries biologist as soon as possible so that they can correctly identify it and then help you with control of that to make sure it doesn't spread. Purple loosestrife is another plant that it can typically be found in dry areas, but it also tends to really like kind of swampy areas along ponds. So just one to watch for as well. That is invasive. Blue-green algae. So this was in the news kind of earlier this summer. Pomme de Terre Lake, and it's a lake in Missouri, kind of southwestish Missouri. They had blue-green algae, and this is of a lot of notoriety because of its toxicity. So blue-green algae can be in high amounts. It can be toxic to humans and to dogs. So there's been kind of issues with dogs drinking water that has this, and they can get sick or even die from it. So you want to make sure that you watch for this. And this is when it is kind of just, we have to let nature run its course, and it tends to have, if we have high numbers of it, it tends to be in the summer, and because water temperatures go up and making the right conditions for this to grow. So just, again, something to kind of watch for. And one thing I didn't include in my PowerPoint today, but might be of interest, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about some of the labs that we have at the University of Missouri available to landowners. And one of those is the water quality lab. So you can send in water samples. And so if you're concerned, not just blue-green algae, but if you're concerned about the quality of your pond water, you can send that off to be tested, and they'll give you back some information about the high nutrient load, how high of nutrient loads it has, if it has a lot of nitrates or phosphates, and some recommendations for that. So just should have put that in here, and I completely forgot. Biological control. So will fish control your vegetation that's a nuisance? Perhaps. So tilapia are not in Missouri supposed to be stocked in ponds, but some folks on private ponds are able to stock them, and they can control, they eat vegetation, but there's not been any good solid research that shows they'll actually control your your vegetation that you have. They also tend to not do very well when the water temperature goes below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is most of our ponds across Missouri are going to fall below that rate. So they are not a long-term solution. Grass carp has been used as a biological control of aquatic weeds. They can be effective, but they're not a cure-all. And sometimes we can go from having the opposite problem where we have a lot of aquatic vegetation, and if we introduce or put in too many grass carp, they can be so effective that we end up with no aquatic vegetation. So this can be also an issue. They also can, so for, a lot of landowners, they really like to have kind of a clear looking pond, which can be hard in Missouri, depending on the substrate that your pond's built on. But grass carp they spend a lot of time kind of rooting in the bottom. So they eat a lot of the root systems of our aquatic weeds, and they'll spend time kind of rooting in the soil at the bottom of the pond. And this can cause a lot of turbidity. And then overstocking of grass carp has been found to affect our sport fish population. So if you're trying to maintain a pond for sport fish, overstocking with grass carp can definitely have a adverse effect on that. And then some of our common things we try to get rid of, like cattails, spatterdock, and filamentous algae, those are the last thing that grass carp tend to eat. So if you're looking at controlling those, I would not look towards grass carp as your control. And then if you do buy these, I would suggest buying triploids. And these are, if you look around for a local farm store, they tend to have what they call fish days. And usually they have a fish farm that comes in and brings in fish that are available for purchase. And this usually includes your sport fish, but also is a source for grass carp oftentimes. And if you buy the triploid, this means that they are unable to reproduce in your pond. So you're only going to have the grass carp that you put in there. So in guidelines for this, stock grass carp only if your pond surface is more than 20% covered in vegetation. And we'll talk about calculating pond size, but you'll want to calculate the pond size accurately because you don't want to have an overstocked pond with grass carp. So the total elimination of vegetation has been found at 30 fish per acre of so in the 10 to 12 inch size class of fish, if you have 30 fish per acre of vegetation, they will eat it all. It'll all be gone. Generally, good vegetation control occurs at 15 fish per acre of vegetation. So especially if you're talking a small farm pond, like half acre, you don't want to introduce too many of these guys. Chemical control. So this is probably the most consistent and kind of overall most effective way of controlling aquatic vegetation. And here is that calculating the area and volume of your body of water. So you want to find the area so length times width, and surface area in acres is your pond area, square feet, divided by 43,560. That's the number of square feet that are in an acre. So this will give you your surface area in acres if you were trying to convert to that for looking at packaging. So oftentimes though, they do have it in feet. So if you calculate that area in feet, you should be good. And then volume of a pond is that average length times average width and then average depth. So this can be tricky. So if you didn't, perhaps you bought property that has a pond on it and you're not completely sure on the depth. Say some of my pond owners know the depth because they built it, so they know how deep it is. Again, this can be collected by utilizing some type of measuring instrument on a boat, kind of finding the average depth of the pond. And I just err on the side of caution or on the low side of volume when you're calculating it for calculating chemicals, because you can always go back and treat, second time But if you add too much and really do a lot of damage, it's hard to go back from that. Here's the response of some common aquatic weeds to some different herbicides. So here's the weed group. So algae and floating plants, again, kind of our most commonly undesirables. So copper complexes, so E means very effective, P means poor, G is good, and then F is fair, if you see any fairs on here. So just what those mean. So copper complexes tend to be really great for controlling algae. So this is, if you see kind of this really clearish blue ponds, those have likely been treated with a copper complex herbicide that's controlling that algae. The rest of our other kind of common aquatic weed herbicides, like 2,4-D, indithol, and fluoridone and glyphosate. So those are pretty poor at controlling algae because of the way like the surface area works of your algae and the interactions of those herbicides. It just does not lead to good results for getting rid of it. Depending on your algae, diquat it works well for filamentous algae and good for our char and nitella algae, but not great for planktonic. So it's important to identify which algae you're using. I always lean towards the copper complexes for algae because they're also, it's fairly reasonably priced and generally you should be able to find that at a local farm store. Then our floating plants. So for floating plants, it's kind of the opposite. So our copper complexes tend to be not great for those types of aquatic weeds. But our glyphosate is okay for water hyacinth, and we don't recommend it for the bladderworts, the duckweeds, or the water meals. And that has a lot to do with like the size and their growing conditions. It doesn't work great if they're not rooted. But fluoridone tends to be quite good for bladderwort, duckweeds, not great for water hyacinth. So depending on if you have multiple plants you're trying to control, you might end up with kind of an integrated approach to treating them with herbicides. Always read the labels on your herbicides before you use them. Make sure that you double check your calculation of your ponds area and volume before you treat them. And again, just follow all those directions. Here's some other, so for the emergent plants, so 2,4-D, it does come in an aquatic. So you've probably, maybe if you've thought about managing invasive species, perhaps like in your woodland or prairie, you might have heard of 2,4-D glyphosate for those applications. They do make aquatic lines of these that are safe to use in our aquatic ecosystems. But you want to make sure, I guess I can't probably say that enough today, to make sure that you read the packaging and know that you're using one that's intended for an aquatic ecosystem before applying. But they are great for a lot of those emergent plants that we find. And I included a few extra things on here that also tend to be, sometimes in the mix, but maybe not the prime issue. Such as like sedges and rushes. Smartweed tends to also grow kind of right along the edge of ponds, water primrose, and then willows. So it's a tree that they prefer aquatic, right along aquatic areas. So, and then here's the submersed plants. So your coontail, your Asian milfoil, your naiads, your pondweeds. Again, copper complexes don't work great for them. They can be harder to treat with the 2,4-D and the glyphosate because they're under the water. So for these, really, your diquat, your indithol, and your fluoridone are going to be your best bets because they do work well on those kind of underwater growing plants. And I forgot to put in here, I should have pulled it from. So I have the Missouri Pond Book link that I'll share at the end and put in the email with the recording. But when we're treating plants, you should not treat your entire your entire pond all at once. I know that sometimes we get excited about control and we're like, oh, we're just going to get rid of all of this all at the same time. But particularly for submerged plants and your duckweed floating plants and your algae, we try not to treat the entire pond at the same time. So in fact, we want to, the usual rule of thumb is no more than 1/3 of the pond at a time. And this is because we're getting rid of these because we're trying to make our pond healthier. But if we treat them all at the same time, like treat the entire pond, all of them will die at the same time, and they're all going to decompose at the same time and cause that deoxygenation and potential fish kill. So we do treat kind of a little at a time, and then that gives us our best results without any of those fish kill catastrophes. Same thing for temperature. So again, ponds tend to be, we will see kind of fish kills that come from deoxygenated water when the water gets hot, because as water gets warmer, the oxygen, dissolved oxygen, gets lower. And so we don't usually try to treat ponds too much when our water temperature is really hot. So like above 70, 75. Pond turnover, and this is about the best picture I could find, but it's still not a great one. But pond turnover we hear about a lot this time of year because it tends to be more common in the fall. And what happens is, just like with air, warm water rises, cold water sinks to the bottom. And so during the summer, the top part of the water heats up, and more, cold water goes to the bottom, and that is fine. We get that cold water at the bottom, especially if our pond is deeper than 6 to 8 feet in places. So all that cold water goes down. It is cool enough. And I know I just said that, oh yeah, cold water has more oxygen. Well, what happens is that cold water is down there, but all of our, like any, dead animals, dead plants, they all make their way down there, and they're going through decomposition, and they tend to suck the oxygen out of this area, and it stays down there, and it's kind of a level of water that's very low in oxygen. And we're fine as long as it kind of stays how it is. So it stays at the bottom. We have our warmer water up at the top. That's where our fish are living. We have aquatic vegetation growing up there, food sources for them, and all as well. Well, then fall comes and the air temperature starts to cool off, and we start to see the surface temperature of our water starts to go down. Well, if it gets lower than this water that's down here at the bottom in our kind of cold zone, if it gets cooler than that, then our pond will turn over. And so that cold, low oxygen water will come up from the bottom to the top, because it's now that cold water on the top from the air temperature, it's sinking down to the bottom. And so that brings up all of that deoxygenated water. And this can lead to some of those fall fish kills that we see. And one way to counter this, particularly in smaller ponds on your property, is you can add aeration. So adding that aeration will then kind of continually churn oxygen into the water, which prevents that loss of oxygen that can lead to fish kills. Terrestrial management for ponds. Highly recommend a riparian buffer of sorts around a pond. And I say this just that there should be vegetation of some sort growing around the pond. This provides a couple things. So it provides a little bit of shade for your pond. So if we think about temperatures, it can help keep us from hitting those really hot summer warm temperatures that can cause fish kill in ponds. But it also provides a buffer for nutrients that are coming, running off into your pond. So oftentimes when we build a pond, we put it in a place where we're going to catch runoff, and that's a good thing. We want to fill our pond with water, but it's also going to catch anything that's running with that water. So that can be nutrients or other, a lot of soil erosion as well. So soil erosion can also lead to like really muddied looking ponds. And so if we have that buffer around our pond, that's going to catch sediment and it's going to catch nutrients, and it's going to help us lessen that nutrient load that goes into our pond. This buffer can be, it can be trees, it can be native plants, it can be even a fescue buffer is better than nothing. So it's going to be catching those things before they run into your pond. Make sure if you are doing any like invasive removal, other plant removal, vegetation removal by your pond, make sure that you're using an aquatic approved herbicide. So there are versions of 2,4-D glyphosate that in glyphosate that are not designed, they've not been chemically made to be as safe for using in aquatic environment, meaning that they don't, a lot of our aquatic ones, the breakdown of them is very fast. So they do not get into our, meaning they break down into something that's non-toxic pretty quickly. So this doesn't affect our things like fish and amphibians that are using those ponds, because again, if you treat something and it maintains its toxicity for a long time, it'll run into your pond. So you want to make sure that if you're doing any treatment of anything close to the pond, that you're using those aquatic approved herbicides. Again, managing runoff, watching for high nutrient runoff. So if you again, in Missouri, most common high nutrient runoff is going to come from livestock. So if you can kind of, design things so you don't have as much of those high nutrient loadings, this can help in the long run with your vegetation issues. And then here's just kind of a picture of, a really nice kind of buffer system, riparian buffer system for along the pond. So, and then if there's any questions, this is the link to the Mow Pond Handbook. And I know you guys can't click on it, so I'll try and put that in the chat. I said I had a lot today, and I did.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So I've got 2 ponds, and one of them has a lot of that primrose, and I'm pretty sure it's more than, I guess you said 25% or so. Mm-hmm. And I would like to try pulling it out first before I go with the herbicides. I am curious though. So when you talk about livestock runoff, so we rent the farm to a farmer who has cattle, and they walk into the pond. So I'm wondering if I'm going to be just in some vicious cycle of trying to treat it, but yet the cows still go in.
Yes, you might still be in because they'll bring with them quite a bit of nutrient loading with them being in there. I'll send you towards NRCS, because they actually do have some cost share that can help fence livestock out of water, and also provide cost share. Again, if you're renting, not sure if you'd be interested, but they can provide cost share for the fencing to keep the livestock out of the water, but also cost share for putting in like solar powered wells or figuring out some other type of watering system for those livestock so they aren't in the pond.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, I have a question. Do you know if the copper complexes have any negative effects on inverts?
I haven't seen any research that documents it, but I would say excessive use of it potentially would.
Okay.
So I cringe a little, because I have seen folks that copper sulfate all the time, and have very blue ponds, and they look very sterile. So, and I talk about this in the woods, like a very sterile woods is not great. Like we like to have a little bit of vegetation in the understory. So kind of the same thing for ponds is okay. It's good to have some.
Sure. One other question, I have folks asking me a lot about using dyes. Do you have, I mean, is that a pretty temporary thing? And does it even give you an advantage to kind of shade out some of those areas? Like I know a lot of people that battle coontail up in my area. And so would that help shade out that initial, bloom period in the early summer, or would it not?
I haven't seen one way or the other, to be honest. So I'll have to ask around because I don't have many folks that use that. And most of the ponds that I have people have had questions about are in a pasture, or on the farm somewhere. So a lot of times we're really concerned about nutrient loading.
Sure. Okay.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. You got your questions ready, Courtney, for next week for Haley?
I'm working on it.
Sarah, I have a question about trees on the pond dam.
Uh-huh.
If you've neglected the dam and allowed trees to grow, should you cut them? Or I've heard if you did, the roots would die and then allow water to flow through the dam. So I'm best just to leave it alone.
Yeah. So the general consensus is to leave them because yes, if you cut them, the root systems will die back, and then that can lead to kind of a breakdown of your dam over time.
Okay, thank you.
So, are they hardy trees? Hopefully.
Unfortunately, there's a mixture of cedar and some oak and others. Yeah, most of them are okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good point you brought up is if you do have a pond that's utilizing kind of a dam system, that you do want to keep larger woody vegetation off that, because they can, just like the muskrats, they can cause damage to your dam system.
Thank you.
Yep. So in the, I should say the pond handbook has I put it in the chat. It has some good resources. I know I probably neglected a lot of other questions as far as like stocking ponds and fish production. If anyone's interested in that, I might see if I can't find us a fisheries biologist to come and talk about that aspect. So again, the biggest problems generally come from vegetation.
I have a question. They sell something called like pond sludge remover, and it's supposed to be like a beneficial pond bacteria and enzyme treatment, like making your water clearer. Do you know anything about how that is or if it works?
Do you know what the active ingredient is?
Let me see here. Well, gee, they just don't tell you, do they? Let's see. Oh my goodness.
So sometimes some of those like if they're supposed to clear the water, it's not always necessarily an active ingredient, but they'll put in I won't be able to think of the name of it, but they'll put material in there that like attracts those like dissolved part, like the sediment that makes water very like murky and dirty looking. It like is magnetized essentially to attract those sediments, and this offers it. Oh gosh, I can't think of the name for it, but it clears it up by drawing all those sediments together, and then they kind of drop to the bottom. So this gives a lot of pond clarity. It's fairly common in, especially like koi pond fish, those types of fish ponds. They will utilize that type of treatment. So it doesn't, there's actually not usually a chemical in there, but it has a ingredient that attracts those and causes them to kind of suck together.
Yeah, it says like an enzyme treatment. So yeah, doesn't really tell you that anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yep. I saw a question. A good time to clear a pond by pulling out. So now is actually a good time to clear a pond out by pulling out the weeds. You just want to make sure, especially if you're pulling them out, because we do worry about turnover in the fall, so we don't want to have too much decomposition going on. But this is a good time if you're worried about kind of like habitat and small. So most of our fish and our amphibians, they're going to have spring into summer that they're utilizing those areas for rearing their young. So now's a good time to remove, especially if you're pulling and you're getting the root systems out. So you're going to see dieback naturally this time of year as it gets colder, just like we do with our other vegetation going into dormancy. But you'll removing it now, removing the roots right now, that'll prevent it from coming back in the spring. All right. Any other questions today? Okay. Next week, like I said earlier, we'll have Haley Lockard with us. She is a farm field biologist with Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. She's going to talk about improving habitat for quail. So should be good. And I will have the schedule for November next week. So we'll go from there. Have a good day.